So before we move on to climate, we still have a bunch of questions to address about what makes us human, what makes us modern human, and whether behavioral evolution is unique to us, and whether that evolution is genetic or if it's learned behavior, so adaptation or adaptability, and whether that is something that is affected by climate, for example, which by now it's clear that it is. So let's put these things in the context of general evolution, then we'll come back to various other things that may have played a role in human behavioral evolution along the way. So the first thing we need to revisit, of course, is again whether evolution itself is gradual, as Darwin would imply, that mutations in genes have to be small and gradual and not huge jumps. And the other idea is that mutation has happened through what are called saltations, so big jumps, or we called it before as punctuated equilibrium, where you have sudden changes that occur on literally an instant, microsecond. Then the impact on anatomical changes and so on happen over some time, and then natural selection has to happen basically on geologic time scales almost. So if we look at the Earth's history again, Hadean is the beginning, where Hades is Greek for hell. So as far as we know, it was primordial soup with a lot of comets and volcanoes bombarding. Archean is Arches, the beginning, where we have the earliest evidences of life or biotic materials, imprints on rocks, and so on. So you have Eoarchean, Paleoarchean, Mesoarchean, Neoarchean, and first living organisms, archaea, which are not bacteria. So we have archaea, bacteria, and eukarya, and we all fit into eukarya. So those were present. And then you have the Precambrian eon. So you get into Proterozoic or early life. So you see Paleoproterozoic, Neoproterozoic, Mesoproterozoic. So first animals, traces, and algae. You have single-celled living things, multicellular living things begin to appear, and this is where things like endosymbiosis, etc., may have also begun, where cells colonize other cells, and they are still mostly prokaryotes, so no nuclei within the nucleus within the cell. And then you have to also remember that oxygen was still very low here, free in the atmosphere. And then in the Ediacaran, before the Cambrian explosion, we find some radial symmetries. This looks like bilateral symmetry, but jellyfish-like things are found here. Jellyfish, for example, first animals with shells and sponges appear. So shell obviously would have been an adaptation to avoid predation, being bitten maybe. And then you have the Cambrian explosion, over 25 million new species appearing suddenly in terms of evolutionary timescales. So then you have trilobites, first fishes, and then life gets complicated with vascular plants, so photosynthetic algae colonizing land. Remember, at this time the plates are also moving around, so the shelf areas, climate, glaciations, everything would have been changing, and CO2 would have been building up, because early on CO2 was not the dominant greenhouse gas by all accounts. We know that solar radiation was 30% less energetic in the beginning, and that means somehow water had to be kept above freezing, so you needed some special greenhouse effects that could allow warm temperatures, so methane would have served there. But let's not go there. That's called the young sun paradox, and I have podcasts on that elsewhere. So once vascular plants evolved, they would have affected climate as well as they began to stand up, affect the friction and the boundary layer, and they of course began to draw down carbon dioxide and locking it up in organic matter, and then you have evolution happening along the way, as we know. And of course you had PT and KT boundaries where mass extinctions happened. Many extinctions happened along the way. There were snowball Earth episodes, and in the geologic time scale, obviously we evolved literally at the last instant in that sense, and many of the things have gone extinct for various reasons, of course, meteorite crashes and flood basalts and so on. And Darwin's idea is, of course, that there is a gradual evolution along the way where small mutations begin to grow, and there could be threshold effects as well. For example, if dinosaurs evolved into birds, small wings would have appeared and slowly the wing size would have grown, and at some point it would have been enough to fly. So those kinds of details we are not going to worry about, because the basic idea of whether change happens rapidly in jumps by saltation or is gradual, as Darwin implies, is a debate that goes on. So here is a schematic of it. Punctuated equilibrium looks at time and says that you have some evolution. Maybe it's a bit gradual here, but essentially it's much more rapid than what phyletic gradualism or species related gradual small mutation evolutions would happen, as Darwinists would insist, or you would have jumps. So here you have a big jump, and then you have stasis, or there is an equilibrium for some time where some species become dominant, and when a new species jumps up and evolves rapidly, there will be competition with the existing species and so on and so forth. So you can see schematically how these look different. And here is another example of gradualism versus punctuated equilibrium. You take a particular let's say a butterfly, it gradually evolves and then maybe by geographic separation or mutation, small mutation would speciate into a different one here, and this lineage would continue and continue to change gradually. As you can see, the color change is happening here and the pattern change is happening here. So this is the morphological change in punctuated equilibrium model, where you have sudden jumps with rapid, also not small but big enough mutations. So you can see another branch evolves here and so on. So these are not questions that are easily answered. So we will come back and look at what it is that we mean by evolution of behavior. Typically when we say evolution, we imply genetic mutations or changes and genetic inheritance. We already alluded to this idea before of whether behavior is genetic, whether it's learned, whether it's transmitted through genes, and we use the example of kids of mathematicians and musicians inheriting some intrinsic abilities for music and mathematics, for example, just as two examples. There are many others you can think of. So we will see that this debate still goes on, whether behavior is really inherited, whether it's learned, or whether it's a combination of the two, and whether it's genetic, whether it's epigenetic, religious, cultural, and so on. And we don't have answers, but before we go on to looking at impact of climate on human evolution, we must at least debate these things as we go along. So let me leave this introduction here, and we'll come back and look at what may make us modern in this sense, and what behavioral evolution actually means as well. Okay, so let's come back and discuss that in a bit.